Hey everyone, I'm HarvestBuildDestroy, and in this video I want to talk about how food works as a gameplay mechanic in Age of Empires 2. If you've seen my previous video on understanding gold, you may recall that I started discussing gold by comparing and contrasting it to Vespene gas in StarCraft. Food, on the other hand, is actually a fairly novel gameplay mechanic in RTS games. We can sort of think of food and wood collectively as being roughly analogous to minerals in StarCraft, but this is an oversimplification, much like the comparison between gold and Vespene gas. The closest comparison I could really make to a resource in another RTS game would be to energy in Total Annihilation and Supreme Commander, but even this is a bit of a stretch. I also mentioned in my video on understanding gold that your food and wood economies collectively represent your empire's production capacity. If we try to separate that into what food and wood each represent individually, I think we end up with something like this. Wood represents your empire's capacity to expand its borders, and food represents your empire's capacity to populate them. But again, this is an oversimplification too. One of the most interesting things about food as a resource is how its value changes as the game progresses. Throughout any given game of Age of Empires, wood is always the least valuable resource. Trees are everywhere and you can upgrade your gather rate 3 times, in addition to wheelbarrow and handcart. Similarly, gold and stone are always valuable, particularly because they run out fairly quickly, forcing you to expand into other areas of the map to continue gathering them. Food, on the other hand, is even more valuable than gold and stone in the early game, but dwindles to being worth nearly as little as wood by the late game, roughly speaking. While micro, unit composition, and so on are certainly important aspects of the game, ultimately, Age of Empires matches are won or lost by manipulating yourself into a position where you're outproducing your opponent to such an extent that you can overcome the game's very high defender's advantage and deal a killing blow. Getting to this point is largely a matter of getting ahead on food. Villagers cost food, and the more villagers you have, the more resources you can gather in total, and consequently, the more units you can create. As the narrator of the William Wallace campaign says, an army marches on its stomach. In the feudal age, almost regardless of your build order, what you're essentially trying to do is stockpile a surplus of food to get to the castle age. Although we may not typically think of it this way while we're playing, all feudal age fighting is essentially a struggle to get ahead on food, since it's so difficult to destroy a town center in the feudal age. We generally think of it more as getting a villager advantage, but the main reason that being ahead on villagers is such an advantage at this stage of the game in the first place is that it allows you to advance to the castle age more quickly, which is ultimately about having more food than your opponent. A higher level player will only gather just enough gold to support their unit composition, so when you kill some of your opponent's villagers in the feudal age, what you're ultimately doing is interrupting their ability to stockpile the surplus food needed to advance to the castle age. This is why archer play is so effective in the feudal age. Archers don't cost food, and are perhaps the best feudal age unit at killing villagers. On top of that, the units that do well against archers, scouts and skirmishers, both cost food. Scouts are melee units, and skirmishers do almost nothing to villagers, so it's difficult for your opponent to punish you for making archers in the feudal age, since you can just wall off and get to the castle age first. From there, you can punish your opponent for investing so much food into feudal units with knights. Food's role in the game starts to open up in the castle age. In the feudal age, you can't build a second town center, so the only way you can get ahead economically is to kill some of your opponent's villagers, assuming both players are maintaining constant villager production and getting their economic upgrades at the optimal times. However, once you reach the castle age, you can make strategic choices about how to invest your food. At this point in the game, you must decide how much of your food to dedicate to villager versus military production, as well as economic versus military upgrades. It's also worth bearing in mind that as supporting multiple town centers becomes an option, the effects of these decisions start to become exponential. If you decide to make villagers from 2 or 3 town centers instead of 1 upon hitting castle, you'll be creating 2 or 3 times as many villagers in the same amount of time as a player who invests the same food in military instead. Whatever resources those extra villagers gather in that period of time are resources you wouldn't have if you had chosen to make units instead. This might sound so obvious so as to be not worth pointing out, but the point I'm trying to make here is that every single military unit that you create at this point in the game is an investment. Once you've reached the castle age and have the ability to make extra town centers, every unit you build is a unit that could have been a villager. We all know that idle villagers are bad, but we tend not to give as much thought to idle military units, aside from maybe our initial scout or eagle. When we look at our armies through the lens of being units that could have instead been villagers, it becomes clear that we really ought not to make units that we don't actually plan to use. If you make a group of knights right as you hit castle but don't use them to pressure your opponent, it probably would have been better to invest those resources into economic upgrades or another town center. However, it's worth pointing out that your units don't necessarily need to be attacking at all times to be worth having made. Consider a standard Drush fast castle build. You don't actually have to kill anything for your militia rush to be effective. The purpose of the Drush is to keep your opponent contained while you advance to castle much earlier than you would have been able to without the pressure from the militia. Something similar could be said for a scout rush into a semi-fast castle. Although it's great if you can get some kills with these units, their mere presence on the map keeps your opponent on the defensive long enough for you to safely click up. Somewhere between late Castle and early Imperial, when you have the infrastructure to produce more or less whatever you want, food's value begins to depreciate, and the emphasis of the game shifts towards controlling the gold and stone on the map. The very nature of how farming works in Age of Empires severely limits the rate at which you can gather food in the early game, but as the game progresses, it becomes easier and easier to gather a lot of food in a short period of time. Once you've hit Imperial, you have access to all of your economic upgrades and no longer need to stockpile food to advance to the next age. In the early game, sustaining farms requires you to invest quite a lot of wood. But by post-Imperial, the cost of farms is pretty negligible, particularly if your civilization has access to crop rotation and two-man saw. In the early game, you need approximately 1 lumberjack for every 3 farms, in order to continue replanting them as they expire. With the two-man saw upgrade, your villagers chop wood around 58% faster than without upgrades, plus the added efficiency of being able to carry more due to handcart. With these 2 upgrades, 2 villagers can chop considerably more wood than 3 unupgraded villagers could have. On top of all of this, each farm contains 550 food with crop rotation, compared to 175 before horse collar, which is more than 3 times as much. It's difficult to calculate the exact number of villagers needed to sustain X number of farms, but at the very least, a single lumberjack can provide enough wood to sustain considerably more than 3 farms in post-Imperial. This is ultimately why the value of food depreciates so much as the game progresses. The large investment required to sustain farms in the early game, coupled with the considerable strength of a town center, limits the effectiveness of all-out aggression. It is this dynamic, perhaps more than anything else, that makes Age of Empires Age of Empires. It might be worth noting here that this is my main criticism of Age of Empires 3 and Age of Mythology. I talked about this quite a bit in my series on Age of Empires 4, but I think it bears repeating here. In both of these games, the link between food and wood is much less pronounced than it is in Age of Empires 2. While farms and mills do require an upfront wood investment in these games, they contain an infinite supply of food and don't need to be replanted. The maps in both games also feature orders of magnitude more huntable animals than Age of Empires 2, so much so that the games feature upgrades to hunter-gatherer rates. In Age of Empires 2, sheep, berries, boar, and deer seem to me to exist as a means of allowing the player to create just enough villagers in the Dark Age to be able to consistently support farms, without providing the player with enough food to consistently produce food-heavy units like militia and scouts. Coupled with the game's naturally high defender's advantage, this serves to limit the effectiveness of early-game cheese strategies. To illustrate what I mean, imagine playing on a map that's as wide open as Arabia, but with Yucatan's starting food. On top of that, imagine that every animal or berry bush contains twice as much food as normal. 200 for a sheep, 280 for a deer, etc. Think about how this would change the game's dynamic. With this amount of starting food, you wouldn't need to build farms for quite a long time, so you wouldn't have to gather nearly as much wood in the Dark Age. Remember, the main reason we gather so much wood in the Dark Age is to prepare for the inevitable transition to farms. Given how strong militia drushes already are on open land maps, I imagine a large portion of the game would revolve around larger-scale militia fighting, probably followed by towers in the feudal age. In this type of scenario, the process of transitioning to archers or castle age from militia or men-at-arms would likely be hard to pull off, since the extra food would allow players to sustain infantry production for quite a while in the feudal age. On normal maps, there just isn't enough natural food to sustain production of militia line units for terribly long. If there was, a player massing militia would likely be able to box a non-drushing opponent in, and possibly even prevent them from being able to build an archery range. While this aggressive style of play could be fun and interesting in its own right, I think it would rob Age of Empires 2 of the strategic diversity that makes it so interesting in the first place. It's not until the Castle Age that players truly have the space to express themselves through the game, and I believe it is the low quantity of natural food coupled with the tether between food and wood through farms that allows Age of Empires matches to get to this stage almost 100% of the time. I think this is why Arena is such a great 1v1 map. Your starting walls allow you to sidestep fighting in the feudal age and get straight to the wide open Castle Age, where you can really bring out whatever it is that makes your civilization unique. Alright, that's about all for this video. To summarize, I think the relationship between food and wood is the secret sauce of Age of Empires. The upfront wood cost required to make farms encourages players to advance through the tech tree, as opposed to committing to all-out aggression. As a result, almost every Age of Empires match makes it to at least late Castle, where the game's large tech tree and complex economy gives players an unrivaled ability to express themselves through the game, and as much as I love StarCraft Brood War, this is why Age of Empires will more than likely always be my favorite RTS game. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please consider rating, commenting, subscribing, or sharing. See you soon.